Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining A4LI for this month's policy discussion. I'm very excited for the conversation we have planned today, and I hope all of you are as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brianna Deutsch, VP of Political Affairs at A4LI. This session will be a little bit different from the others. I'll run a discussion with Melanie and James for half an hour, and then we'll do the Q&A offline. So please put your questions in the chat, and A4LI President Dylan Livingston will follow up with each of them after the event. Our guests today are Melanie Doringo, Democratic candidate for New York's 3rd Congressional District, and James Peyer, CEO of Cambrian Biopharma. In this conversation, we'll touch on James and Melanie's background and specifically why they are passionate about longevity medicine, as well as Melanie's current longevity policy priorities and what a geroscientist like James would like to see congressional candidates like Melanie prioritize, among other topics. Melanie, let's start the conversation by getting to know you a little bit better. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be aware of and interested in longevity.
Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. For me, I spent my career in preventive health. I have a master's in exercise physiology, and I am deeply interested in health equity and fighting against the health inequities in our current system. Our healthcare system, in my opinion, operates very much in a broken way. It's more of a sick care system than a healthcare system. So I spent my whole career helping folks try to live healthier lives, by developing preventive health strategies. And I came to longevity because I met Dylan, actually, and Dylan and I had a nice conversation. And Dylan had not known so much about my background and what has driven me to be such a strong advocate for a true healthcare system. And what interested me about longevity was that it was, my work, while it's been rooted really more on the preventative side, this seems to be an opportunity to almost address inequity once it's already there. Oftentimes once something is broken, it's a lot harder to fix. So I see almost this field as sort of two ends of the same coin, which is really trying to help folks live dignified, healthy, happy lives.
So on that note, just another question for you. How do you think your healthcare agenda would fit in with the longevity community's agenda? So for example, would you support more funding to the NIA Division of Aging Biology? Would you support reforming the FDA to make it easier for longevity companies to run their clinical trials? And in general, are there any policy proposals you think would help extend healthy human lifespan in the US?
Yeah, so, in terms of funding, I think, obviously we're talking in a general sense. So we have to have a fleshed out sense of exactly what we're funding, right? Where I would be most interested in, if we are ensuring that this funding would go to all people, right? Not just, the ones who could afford it. If it's an equitable system where, all aging folks would have an opportunity to reap the benefits of any findings, then absolutely, I would support additional funding. And same thing with clinical trials with the FDA. I think we have to really understand what we're funding, but it's definitely something I'm learning more about. I'm very interested. I think it's very promising, and definitely interested in working together to learn a little bit more. But in terms of, are there policy proposals that I think would help extend healthy lifespans? Yes, of course I do. As I mentioned earlier, I'm talking about my background as an allied health professional, deeply invested in preventive healthcare. And I think that, from a policy perspective, it intersects with many issues, right? So there's certainly creating a true preventive healthcare system in this country, but it's also access to healthy food. It's access to green spaces, to clean air, to clean water, to look at what are the social determinants of health, and then how do we implement policy initiatives to ensure, from a preventive side, that we can keep people healthier longer. As most folks probably know on this call, it's much more cost effective to keep people healthy than it is to try to help them become healthier after they're sick. So, that's really where my background lies. And that is where I think there is a natural alliance between the longevity community and a lot of the policies that I support.
Great. And that's, one of the reasons why we love having geroscientists and, someone who is in politics on the same panels so that you can sort of like learn from each other and have a conversation. So now we're gonna turn it to James, and James is a familiar face in the longevity community, but typically, you speak about the importance of private sector investment. So what do you think the government must do to expedite the advancement of longevity treatments, and what are the major roadblocks that you see at this moment?
I mean, the longevity space is in kind of this special spot because it is quite different from most of pharmaceutical development for exactly the reason that you just pointed out, Melanie, that it's more focused on like a healthcare approach as opposed to like a sick care approach, which is how most drugs are developed. But the regulatory system that we have in place here in the US, it's mostly designed to approve drugs for sick care. You have a patient, you treat a patient with a drug in a clinical trial, and then that drug can get approved. And the FDA has paths available for preventative medicine. They're just really hard. It's just hard and expensive to run trials for prevention because you have to have many more people involved in your trial, and they have to just go for a lot longer. So the interesting thing about this field to me is that the private sector, this small group of people in the longevity community, we've kind of solved many of these issues to give this field legs, even in the absence of government action. But those are all compromises that we've had to make. So like, as a perfect example, like every drug within Cambrian's pipeline, so we have 18 drugs that we're developing that are all geroscience drugs, but they're all treating existing diseases first. And only after we treat an existing disease, show that the drug is safe and effective within the sick care system, then we can do preventative health stuff afterwards. And almost the whole of the private sector industry is structured this way. And so if I were talking to government officials, or if I were to say like, oh, this is what the government can do here, it's really all about priorities, that we have pathways and technical solutions to run better preventative health clinical trials, which is what this field needs in order to thrive. But we need to put the priority of lawmakers, of regulators on this topic as a focus area. The details of this, to your earlier point, Melanie, will really involve deep technical conversations with regulators. So we don't just want to say, let's push this thing forward, let's push this thing forward. But setting a list of priorities is a great thing that I think members of Congress can do that then cascades down into the technical levels of regulatory implementation. And I think that's where we're going to see a change. And I think that really can start at the congressional level by doing things that are sort of large swath, sort of or broad strokes, like we're going to pivot from sick care to healthcare, and what does that mean?
James, a follow-up question to that last one. It seems like one of the major components or one of the major roadblocks right now that's preventing the longevity industry from moving forward and getting these longevity treatments across the clinical trial finish line is that, we need to establish some sort of industry-wide biomarkers of aging that both the government and scientists can agree on. And this conversation has sort of been happening for a while, and we haven't seen a whole lot of progress. So do you think this is even possible? And if so, how do we get past this biomarker issue?
So it's definitely possible because we did this once before and the government helped, right? So there was this thing that, Melanie, I'm sure you're actually probably familiar with because it's right in your background. It's the Framingham Heart Study, where starting in the 60s, we started tracking people and doing diet and exercise interventions and tracking what that did to people's cholesterol levels, and showed that cholesterol levels, when they went down, heart disease risk also went down, right? And that was the basis for our modern understanding of cholesterol, which changed how we think about diet, exercise, but also some of the very, very small number of medicines that we use in prevention started with that study, which was really all funded through government action. And the US government is doing a lot in this space right now, as far as funding basic research into things like this. But where we are not doing enough is setting this as a priority, right? So we have a National Institute of Aging. That institute is the smallest of all of the NIH institutes, and the vast majority of its funding goes to basic research in Alzheimer's disease, not in aging broadly. And so, a great way to test something like the Framingham Heart Study, but in a much bigger way and get data faster, would be to do something like the metformin trial that the FDA actually signed off on and approved. But they told the creators of this trial to go raise private fundraising from billionaires and wealthy people to run this trial instead of setting it as a priority of their own. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity, because the academics that set up this trial and the 10 universities that signed on to do this, they were really hoping that this could be an NIH, National Institute of Aging priority. And the government just said, no, it's actually not for us. It's not a big enough priority. And that's where that biomarker stuff is going to come from chipping away at generating high quality data in collaboration with top tier academics, companies. It's a multifaceted effort, but back to my earlier point, it starts with Congress setting a priority that cascades down into the different arms of the government.
Thanks, James. So this next question is for both Melanie and James. So we all know that for anything to get through Congress, oftentimes there has to be bipartisan support. That's just the reality of how things work. And I think, sort of both sides of the aisle these days are beginning to recognize that we have this sort of disease-centric approach to healthcare. And we need to, switch it over to a more preventative approach to healthcare. So Melanie, beginning with you, what sort of bipartisan initiatives do you think that your potential colleagues in Congress can agree on that will help move our sort of healthcare paradigm to a more preventative one?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think we need to set the terms, right? I think oftentimes as constituents of members of Congress or community members, we're looking at Congress and we're saying, why can't you work together in a bipartisan manner? And maybe they are, maybe they're not, but the issue is that we often have different end goals, right? And I think the way you frame that question is, how do we switch to more of a preventive healthcare system? And I think the first step in working together in a bipartisan manner is clearly identifying that we want to switch to a more preventative model. I am an ardent supporter of universal healthcare, Medicare for all, and I know in these divisive political times, there are folks that don't even know what it means, but they hate it. They hate it. They hate it. They don't want to talk about it. And what we have done in the work that my advocacy work and certainly within my campaign, when I meet folks, and I don't care what their political ideology is, when we talk about healthcare and I explain to them what a universal healthcare system would look like, we usually get the folks on board. And it doesn't matter what their political ideology is. So for me, I think I would like to see it happen sooner than 10 to 15 years. I would like to see a universal healthcare system implemented. I'm a supporter of Medicare for all. I truly believe that is the only model that will shift the frame of a sick care system to a true preventive healthcare system. And this is where we'll actually be able to really focus on, in my opinion, the right end goals, right? Which is helping people live healthier lives, more full, comprehensive, dynamic, joyful lives, right? That is where our focus should be. But to do that, we need to move that away from the big profits of insurance companies, their bottom line, because right now insurance companies are being paid to deny care. It's almost an incentivized system for them to make more money. And that does not help the longevity community. It does not help everyday folks living across the country.
Picking up on that, because I know, Brianna, you're wondering about kind of like bipartisan things. I actually think that like a little bit of a focus on Medicare can create a bipartisan approach on this longevity topic or on this preventative health topic. because one of the reasons that I think is the basis of much of the stuff that you just said, Melanie, is that right now we're in a situation where Medicare is the primary form of health coverage for Americans over 65, right? Almost all Americans over 65 use Medicare as their health insurer. And private insurance is mostly people under 65. And that means that for the diseases of aging, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, et cetera, it's really the US government that ends up being on the hook for a lot of these costs. And we as taxpayers are paying for our underinvestment in prevention in younger people, right? In people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And so I would say whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, like on the Democratic side, there's an argument to be made that, hey, if we invest in preventative health early, we could do that through, a system like Medicare for all, but there's also many other flavors of that just kind of forces us to take the overall health of a person from earlier in life until later in life and not just make them the government's problem only when they turn 65. I think that's a compelling position. But then on the Republican side, even if you just wanted to take a fiscal approach to this, a big part of the costs, the rising costs of Medicare are on account of dealing with these chronic diseases of aging. And so if you wanted to just take like a budget hawk position on Medicare, one of your priorities should be figuring out how to get coverage of preventative medicine to people under the age of 65, because it's, to Melanie's earlier point, like our body is a little bit like a china vase, and it's way easier to figure out how to not tip the vase over than wait for it to tip over, shatter, and try to put all of the pieces back together. And I think, I'm gonna save that debate for people on the Hill, but I think that the Medicare for all approach is one way of making sure that people prior to the age of 65 are incented, like those systems, the Medicare system would be incented to give coverage and put a focus on prevention. I'm sure there are others as well, but I think that this topic of preventative medicine is a unifying thing that could bring people from all walks of the political spectrum together. And I think that's one of the reasons I really like it. I don't know how you feel about that statement. Maybe it's a little too neutral, Melanie.
No, it's not that it's too neutral, but I did just want to make a quick point, just because, not everyone is familiar with Medicare for all, and they think that it's actual Medicare. And I just want to make the point that it is not actual Medicare. It's a bad name, in my opinion. I think it should be called comprehensive healthcare for all. It actually would expand healthcare to include vision and dental and hearing, and it would cap pharmaceuticals at $200 a year. So I just want to make that distinction because I think that's important. And I love what you said, James, about taking, if you're a Republican and you wanted to take a budget hawk stance on this, Medicare for all would save hundreds of billions of dollars every year. It would save 68,000 lives a year. So that case is very clear. And in fact, in 10 years, it will cost us less than our current system. And yes, you're right, we could have other systems, but I have to do my plug here. I hope you don't mind. Listen, instituting universal health care via Medicare for all, comprehensive health care for all, healthcare is a human right in this country, is the fiscally responsible approach. I think it's the morally responsible approach, but it's also, from a preventive sense, it's, in my opinion, it's really the only way forward if we truly want to invest in preventive care.
James, feel free to weigh in on Melanie's response. Otherwise, I'll move to one or two audience questions because I think we have time.
Sure. I mean, I think we could have a long conversation about the right insurance system to cover people. I don't want to put my hand on the scale too hard one direction or another. I would only reiterate that I think one of the fundamental ills of our current system is the fact that right now the insurance world that covers people under the age of 65 have almost no incentive to invest in preventative health. So all of the gains that we've had in preventative health coverage over the last 3 decades have come from one of two sources, right? Either the government stepping in and say, hey, look, we're on the hook for all of this money for people over 65, so every insurer better cover this, right? Which requires an activist regulatory approach, or patient advocacy, where the data is so strong that doctors and patients essentially demand something of their insurer because they're like, we want this to be covered. I think mammograms are a great example of that. And there are some other preventative health approaches that followed that same pattern. So in order for this longevity thing to work, we have to recognize that we're in a business system with broken incentives. And when you're in a business system with broken incentives, you either need advocacy from grassroots or action at the political level in order to kind of run upstream, right? Because the incentives are, it's like a current, right? And so we have to recognize that some of this stuff in preventive medicine is running against the current. It's why we built the business side of this, running with the current, treating diseases that exist today. But if the long-term vision is to be a salmon and go upstream, that means we need allies at the patient and physician level and allies at the political level to make this happen. And it is a collective will to bring something into existence that will make this happen, not overnight, but over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that if we find more allies that we can bring together to kind of set that North Star, every person and every effort increases the chances that we'll get there together.
Great. So now I'm going to move on to 1 or 2 questions from the audience because we have about 6 more minutes. So this one is on the topic of preventative medicine, which we've been discussing. And one thing that we can all agree on is that the pandemic has sort of changed or impacted the way we do healthcare a little bit, especially with telemedicine. So do you think sort of, the growth of telemedicine, let's start with Melanie, the growth of telemedicine throughout the pandemic has maybe helped create a shift to a more preventative approach, or have you not seen much change?
I think telemedicine has certainly helped with an accessibility issue, and it certainly provides an opportunity to high quality care for folks who otherwise cannot get to a doctor or may live in a medical desert. That's very important, but I don't think that it has solved the preventive piece of it. Generally, no. I think when folks go seek out a telemedicine, it's usually because they have a cold or they have an infection. And that to me is the real preventative. When I talk about preventive medicine, I'm talking about what are the lifestyle factors that we can implement to ensure a person stays healthy, right? And certainly in the longevity community, we're talking about something a little bit different. But as I said, I think they're 2 sides of the same coin, right? There's something different about taking medication to cure a disease and then taking preventive medicine to ensure that you stay healthy. I'm curious to hear your opinion here, James.
Yeah, I know founders of a number of different companies who have really been trying to innovate in the telemedicine for prevention space. And I think one of the issues that we've had generally is that there's a fair amount of knowledge out there about preventative health. But to your point, Melanie, it's not well distributed. And so telemedicine is a way that you can sort of enhance the signal of something that the community wants, right? And so if you have a small number of doctors that are interested in preventative health, but a large number of people that would like access to this, telemedicine has been a signal amplifier for those physicians, their practices. This idea of like functional medicine, I think, is really being amplified by telehealth platforms like, there's like Parsley Health and Forward and a series of these, which are mostly launching, interestingly enough, in the big cities with physical clinics, but then telehealth accessibility everywhere in the country. But I generally agree with Melanie's point that like this access to physicians is only one of a large number of problems. The biggest one for me, I mean, I come from a biased perspective because I run a drug development company, is that we just don't have the tools that we need to really put a priority on preventative health. We need to run clinical trials that unambiguously show the world, hey, this drug prevents multiple diseases of aging in a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial that meets the highest gold standard that the FDA can put in front of us. And that will provide the incontrovertible proof that says this field really has something to it. And this should be a thing that is accessible to everyone. Until that time happens, I think distribution channels like telehealth are a secondary consideration for doing the best we can now with an incomplete toolbox.
So I think one of the tools that members of Congress have is this ability to have a platform and reach a number of constituents and also have conversations with other members of Congress. And it seems like even though for folks in the longevity community, it's so obvious that we need to sort of take this approach. A lot of members of Congress and just the American public maybe doesn't quite get it because they haven't really been informed about it. And here we are, we have this looming silver tsunami. Some of our entitlement programs may become insolvent if we continue on the current path. So what do you think from a messaging perspective, Melanie and James, real quickly, what do you think we can do to get people on board? We've done this before with anti-smoking campaigns and other initiatives where members of Congress have really taken a lead. So what do you think we can do to get the message across?
Well, firstly, I don't think they're entitlement programs, right? I think these are services that our country offers folks that often they have paid into, right? So I wouldn't qualify them as entitlement programs. But as I said earlier in this conversation, I think, the world is truly our oyster here in the terms of preventive health. There are a multiple amount of intersecting factors here, from housing to climate to agriculture, to schools and even our workplace laws, right? There's such an intersecting group of factors and policies that could implement preventive health. Smoking campaigns, sure, that's just a tiny little piece in a broader array, right? There's mental health, preventive health issues from the mental health space as well. So I think, where it starts is really, maybe it's bringing it back to your earlier biomarker question in a way. It starts by identifying what are the factors of a healthy life. And we do have social determinants of health that influence a variety of, potential comorbidities, but we have to start there. And then we build upon it. How do we implement policies? Look, everything that we do is a policy choice, right? So if we have folks, if we have folks who are suffering, we have health inequities. These are all policy choices. So we can reverse that easily and implement policy solutions that will bring about, better and certainly healthier living.
Great. James, go ahead real quickly. I know we have to end the conversation at 5:30 Eastern.
That's right. I know we're about at time, but I just wanted to quickly mention the other thing that is sort of a snowball that's already rolling down the hill and gathering some momentum is that thanks to efforts like A4LI, we're helping to fix longevity's biggest problem it's had for a long time, which has been a framing and messaging problem around the fact that a lot of people have been offering what we are now scientifically doing for many thousands of years. And until now, it's essentially always been wrong, right? And that's a huge thing. So the fact that we are talking about this, not in terms of, philosophical concepts like, oh, would you like to live to 200 or 1,000 or something like that? Instead, focusing in on where the science actually is, which is how can we use this new knowledge that we've gained to build medicines that can prevent people from getting Alzheimer's disease, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Focusing in on that topic and where the science really is something that almost everybody wants. And I think that shift is actually the most fundamental one for building a big tent that can attract people to this cause, especially as we go outside of people who, I think I've been doing this for 20 years. And if you go back 20 years, it was mostly people who were interested in this from a philosophical perspective. And now it's people who are thinking about it from a practical implementation perspective.
That's very true. Thank you, James. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So I just want to again, thank you to Melanie and James for joining us and for their time. And we hope to see all of you again in April for the next installment of our policy discussion series. So have a good afternoon or evening, wherever you are.
Okay, lovely talking to you, Melanie. Thanks, Brianna.
You too. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.